Alright, my friends, this is my channel, The Grease Man, and I want to talk about Bob Lazar for a while. I'm thinking I'm going to do some off and on videos for this channel and things that have interested me, and this is one of those things. I was just graduating high school in 1985 when I started hearing rumors of this particular individual. I was in the mid 80s, late 80s, Bob Lazar and his spectacular claims. And you can go online, you can Google, and you can go to the internet, and you can find loads and loads of stuff on this particular subject material, Bob Lazar himself, and a whole lot of other conspiracy material and things like this. Uh, but and recently, and I'll be clear, recently, and I have to figure out how I'll plug in the uh, uh, oh shoot the link to Joe Rogan's interview with Bob Lazar, because I watched this 3 or 4 weeks ago, and it kind of reignited my interest in the topic. And there's a lot of conjecture, there's a lot of conspiracy this, conspiracy that, and I want to do things from my perspective, my opinion, a literal opinion. I'm going to listen and look and keep an open mind on all the stuff that I can find on regarding this material and Bob Lazar in general. But we're not going to speculate. Is it true? Is it fantasy? Is it legit? Is it not? We're going to take it literally. Just look at this as literally as possible. So when I look at this fellow, the original claims came out in the early 80s to have worked at a place called S4. His job was to reverse engineer some exotic technology, some extremely exotic technology. And then, after a short career there, and some quite honestly believable reasons for more or less being kicked out of the program, and it's rumored that the government or somebody tried to went to great lengths to try to create or to erase his history, to disprove who he was, or to make it so it sounded like he was part of the establishment, intentionally trying to confuse the conspiracies. It's said that he passed all the attempts, any attempts made for lie detector tests. And I know firsthand, I have taken a lie detector test several times in my lifetime as part of my career or possible career jobs. And I know that it is not 100% science. It's probably a 75% science. And part of that has to do with whether or not the persistent, do you, if you're taking the test, do you believe you? Do you believe you're telling the truth? If you feel you believe that you are telling the truth, you will pass the test. Simple as that. It's like body language. If you believe and you casually believe what you're saying to be truthful and not some fabricated story, or you've told that story so many times that you more or less have bought the bulldog. You drank the Kool-Aid yourself. So taking a lie detector test of any sort is not going to necessarily be the thing that says, oh, he's lying. I don't buy into that stuff. He's also often claimed to be an American conspiracy theorist. That he goes to yet the man goes to great lengths to outright refuse, close to almost outright refusing to talk about his experiences in the first place. I mean, once again, go look at the Joe Rogan interview and listen to him talk, and go back and look at some of the original interview stuff that was put out in the 80s and listen to him talk. His story has not changed all that much. I mean, it's changed like an older person remembering a younger person's perspective on things. It will change. His recollections of things have dimmed a little bit in some aspects, or may have looked like they are different a little bit. But for the most part, the story, to my best I can see, the story remains the same. That there's no significant change there. So when I look at this from the 80s, this is a guy who supposedly builds a rocket car, jet engine jet car and then starts driving it to his work. He is a person who went through science, the colleges and universities, developing and gaining a scientific background and gaining the pedigree and the experience and knowledge that scientists or a scientific engineer would have. And yet, by his own admission and admissions of others, he's not exactly the top of the block. He's not the 99% club. He's the average Joe Blow who did what he needed to do to get himself a good education, to find a good job, to support his family. And the fact that he would be chosen for a potentially extremely highly classified project, well, in an outright beginning, seems absurd. But if you look at it from a literal perspective, it makes perfectly good sense from the perspective of those people offering somebody in this position something like this. And here's a couple of reasons in my thought process on this for why that would be true. I mean, for starters, it's implied that the program was not comprehensive. While it was large and it had diverse and had lots of different people working on different projects, as an entity, it was not well managed. It was not well run. They were so obsessed with security that the security become detrimental, in Lazar's own words, to making any really serious attempts at back engineering something or scientific discovery, because you're only allowed to have you and one other person and perhaps your handler have any conversations or headbutting with the particular thing you're working on or you're assigned to. So the fact is that they were going too much to the extreme, where usually it takes a group of people, those aha moments, often in completely unrelated settings, where they're sitting around a table somewhere having beer at a bar, and they're all firing off all these crazy things and this, that, and the other thing, and suddenly they come upon an epiphany or an aha moment because of something somebody else said or did, or because the 5 or 6 of them started getting into something and start bouncing ideas off each other's heads, and no matter how radically crazy they might have sounded, suddenly stumble across one of those eye-opening things where you go, oh, maybe we should look into that. Maybe we should try and do that sort of thing. So another aspect to this is, why offer this fellow? It was an opportunity that just sort of happened. If you listen to the story, if you take the story literally, he went to a thing and met another person who was a scientist who had some connections, and they hit it off, mostly talking about jet cars and other related material that later translated into an opportunity for a job. Because then when he started looking, he went searching for a job, and he sent this guy a letter, and this guy gave him a contact, and Lazar made a contact, and then suddenly found himself offered what you would be considered the dream job, or the job of a lifetime kind of thing that you just can't believe until you're there and you're in the middle of it. And then why not get to one of the 1% of the top of the class? Why not go for them? Well, for starters, not to make anything against Bob Lazar, because he's, from what I can see and I hear and understand, the man is a credible, if not unspectacular, scientist in what he does. He's just one of thousands of others just like him who go to work, enjoy what they do, and work and don't do anything great and spectacular that we know of, except this thing here. So those 1%ers, on the other hand, we're looking at people who might be, look at Sheldon, for example, brilliant in his field, but a nut. So they're either controversial just because they're in the top percent, or they're going to be so influential at some point. You really don't want somebody that has the potential for that much gain or fame or pedigree dealing with these black box, black budget, super secret programs. It's just like when you look at, from a literal sense, his level 30, 31 majestic level clearance or whatever. So we have 30 odd levels, and I've seen this referenced in other places on the internet, so I know that, and the literal plausibility makes sense to me, that the government has buku layers of clearance. So, for example, why has no president ever gone around and said that they looked into Area 51 and discovered the aliens and talked to them? Well, because first off, the president's an elected position who only gets elected twice at best. He's only going to serve for 8 years. And so unless he's been a congressman or senator for 20 or 30 years before getting elected to president and had worked in the areas of geopolitical management that would run programs of this nature, he would not have access to very high level clearance in the first place. This would be a needed and as need basis. That makes me think of that clip from Independence Day when the flunky in the background, who's a pain in the ass, suddenly the president turns to him and says, "What do you mean?" And he says, "Well, not exactly true, President." And then the president looks at him and says, "Well, what do you mean?" And the truth is, the president isn't worthy enough to know of these sort of layers of what's going on, and would be actually detrimental to clearance and to security. Plus, there's such a large volume of programs and things going on behind the scenes in any world-class A government that is just too much material for one individual to maintain more than a passing knowledge in. So, there's no reason for the president to have a level 31 majestic clearance. And most of the government wouldn't either. And then we look at this from a lateral perspective. I think a lot of people in my opinion, probably mistake or misunderstand how clearance things work. When you say you get this tree, this stack, this vertical stack, and every layer higher is much more secure. I don't think it works that way. I honestly don't. I think it reaches to a certain point, and then it becomes a horizontal matrix. So we're going to have a level whatever, and we may not call it, and it's absurd to even call it what we call it. We just do it for convenience sake. We call it this level system of clearance and secret what have you. But I think it's much more convoluted than this, and to me a literal makes sense to be much more complicated. So instead of it being a vertical tree that you climb, it's a horizontal niche that you find. So in this aspect, the reason his clearance is what it is because it needs to be specific to the program that Lazar was involved in. So they called it whatever they called it. And at the time, because of the Majestic 12 BS of the 50s and 60s, there's a nostalgia. There's a nostalgia even amongst the clerical bean counters of the government. So having something is a running gag. It's like later when they officially discover and add element 115 to the periodical chart. It's up. UUP. It's a play on words to some degree. It is suggesting that this is the stuff that could potentially project you up and out, or up and through. So, I mean, that's a different thing for a different day. And I'll let you know, I am not a scientist. I am not a highly graduated anybody. I didn't go to college until I was 30, and it was after I worked in the manufacturing field for making paper bags, for criminy sakes. I did 10 years making paper products for manufacturing, feed and seed bags and cardboard. Prior to that, I worked in the restaurant field and convenience stores. I was assistant manager. I got shot at, I got cut, I got scars from working in some pretty nasty neighborhoods, etc., etc. I went to college to be and earned a degree in auto tech or AutoCAD, so drafting with computers, and ended up becoming a waste disposal technician. I pump grease. Hence the term the grease man. Right? I don't even use my college education, so I'm just doing this from my opinion and my personal view because I want to. Right? So when we looked at his claim to having this high level clearance, I don't think it's per se high level. I think it's cultural. It's niche level. It means it's out on the right, so it's very far out on the right or very far on the left, and it's targeted to a particular class of people who do specific things in research and development for the government. And to get into those, you fit into this category, which is why your top level clearance will not grant you clearance into unrelated programs or unrelated places or unrelated things. Now, was his clearance at the time superior to that of, say, the president? Absolutely. But because it was not, because he was somewhat plateau high, much higher than the president, he was just so far off to the left or right of what the president needs to have access to that the presidents would never have access to that niche. That's just my opinion on that. So when we look at his pedigree, he's not exactly a rocket science or a great, huge, hardcore, heavily experienced individual. This guy is not too long out of the university, and he's offered an opportunity. I think it's because, and they address this a little bit in the interview, and Lazar himself, it's because he thinks outside the box. He has a fresh mind, fresh set of eyes, a fresh set of ideas to tackle a long stymied problem. It's implied that the government has access to at least 9 of these craft that he knew of, because he's seen 9 craft. Whether or not Lazar admits he can't honestly say what they were. He just knows that they were all lined up in adjacent hangar bays with the craft that he had some interaction with. And so he can't honestly say 100% that they're all alien craft, that they're not manufactured craft. He can't honestly say that if they're all from the same alien species, because he has no access to their knowledge, and he doesn't have that niche lateral clearance to know. So when we get into his environment, he gets there and he's presented with some stuff that's absolutely fantastic. It's borderline magic, he says. And that makes perfectly good sense to me. I mean, he's looking at a technology that's superior by huge margins to anything we can produce at that time. And I suspect even now, at this time, he's still vastly outside our capability of just barely scratching the surface of understanding. But just scratching the surface, gaining any knowledge of a superior, highly technological, advanced technology of any sort is a major increase for us in increments. Even in increments, it's huge. And I'm planning on doing a video or two on that, I think, too, in the coming months. Because I'm a child of the 80s, and I remember, and so should you if you were in my age bracket, of a sudden, just seemed like technology exploded out of nowhere. There was a whole slew of advances that came out, very critical advances, because most of our advances come and go in waves. And right now, we see a lot of fantastic technology today, but most of that fantastic technology is just refined versions of those aha moments from 30 or 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. If you look at let's just look at the internet. The internet exploded in the late 80s, early 90s. It came out of a number of different possible scenarios of people coming together or coming up with concepts and ideas and needs and filling them. But now, here we are, 40 years later, 35 years later, we absolutely can. Our society worldwide absolutely cannot function without access to the internet. And the idea that we would have this back in the day was just absurd, right? I mean, and everything that goes along with the internet. You would not have wireless cell phone technology today without some serious breakthroughs in the 80s. A sudden aha moment explodes, along with the fact that it was carried along with the technology that feeded the internet. I mean, there's so much connection here and interconnectability that it's this very confused web. And there's lots of places on the internet. You can Google any of these things and go out and find what was the 7 great inventions of the 80s, for example. And I want to do a piece on it because Lazar says something to Rogan that tripped my mind, and I took a note down on it because I think I'm going to talk about that too. But there's just not enough time and I'm not going to waste hours and hours on these things. But I have, like I said, been taking notes in my very crude handwriting. Possible there were So there were others far more subtle and educated to choose from. So why him? Constant conspiracies. Implies most of the nine craft perform this, that, and the other thing. Unscheduled nuclear explosions. Well, he makes a comment about that. That one of his the person he replaced, or one of those people he replaced, apparently they just decided they weren't learning anything fast enough, so they wanted to take an extreme chance. So they use a plasma cutter or some kind of device to cut into an active alien reactor. Well, I'm pretty sure if you took a plasma cutter to a modern nuclear reactor that's active, you're going to have a similar result. But apparently there was an unscheduled nuclear explosion in the testing grounds nearby shortly or right about the same time this supposed uh, you know, attempt was made, which also cost the lives of several researchers. Once again, let's step back a minute. Why would you get the top of the top and then have them take a bazooka to a nuke to see what happens? That's absurd. So maybe the results of taking a plasma cutter of some sort to an alien reactor that presents the potential for one of the 19 unscheduled nuclear explosions that took place in the 80s to the replacement of needing a new scientist to come in and continue the research of the previous bloke who now blew himself up is possibly because A, he wasn't the top of his class. I mean, he wasn't quite savvy enough to go, hey, this is a great idea, but maybe we better not do it because I don't want to die. Or maybe we should figure out how to do this remotely so we can cut into this thing with the cameras going while we're sitting a couple kilometers away in a bunker. Even in the 80s, they had that kind of technology. I'm just saying. Just that, the great 80s discoveries. And I've been, like I said, I got a number of different things going on in here, so I've got thoughts on the subject, right? So, get it. Somebody that's new to the field. There's another aspect. When I graduated from the local community college with what's equivalent of a 3-year degree, I went 5 semesters total, and they were all crammed together, and it's called an Associate of Applied Sciences degree as opposed to an Applied Sciences degree. It's another step. It's kind of in between that and a bachelor's degree. At least this is how it's explained to me. So when I went out and started looking for jobs with this new diploma, I ran into 2 terrible conundrums. First one was they would ask me, well, you're 30 years old. What kind of background do you have? And I didn't have any background in construction or manufacturing of significant items. We manufactured paper sacks. I drove a forklift and loaded trucks. It gave me no working experience. I wasn't in construction. I didn't do framing. So these people would look at me at 30 years old, and I have no practical experience with this degree that I now have. And they would shake their heads and say, well, we kind of really need somebody with some experience. And nobody would give me the experience. I just kind of fell into a wall on that. The other half of that same coin was the age. They looked at me and said, well, if you were 18 or 20, we could mold you into what we want. We could take your degree and continue to teach you to do how we do and what we do and what we want to do and be successful, more successful than somebody at 30. And I was, first time in my life I had been ever, at 30 years old and being told I'm old. I was very dejected about it. So from this perspective, hiring somebody fairly fresh out of the university in these very fantastic fields or moderately similar fields of technology and putting them in those black budget operation science opportunities is not as crazy as you would think. There's a lot of options there. There's a lot of opportunity. Because he refers to this other fellow named Barry, who was obviously in the program, had been in the program a while, and all but lived there. So he had no life outside of the program. And he probably was there for some time and would probably still be there or in some similar program later on. And he's narrow focused. He's focused. He's got blinders on. He only sees the thing, or the whiz bang, or the widget in front of him. And so bringing in somebody fresh out of school with obviously a creative mindset. I mean, how many guys can say they built a jet engine or put a jet engine in their car and drove it to work on a regular basis? That just puts you in one of those kind of oddballs that they want to exploit, because the opportunity for you to look at things from a completely different set of angles. So it makes absolutely sense. Just like it makes absolutely sense that Bob Lazar, and he makes these commentaries, after he'd been there for a little while, his excitement and awe became dread and fear. He started to realize that he was tampering, or they were messing with technology so far out of our knowledge. And we use the term advancement. It's so far advanced from us. And I find that misnomer misleading to some degree. I think it'd be more appropriate. That's why I made a commentary about it being exotic as opposed to advanced. Yes, it's advanced as we know it, but not necessarily so. I mean, the epiphany thing. It always amazes people after the fact. Why didn't we see? Why didn't we understand how simple something was after the fact? The technology that powers this device, the technology that manufactured this device that he worked on, is exotic, which is why it's magical, because it's outside of our comprehension. We barely can scratch at it. It's the epiphany of the orangutans. The orangutans spearfishing. The orangutans are mimicking what they've seen from humans, but by doing so, they're learning skills that they didn't have before, including yet another clever way of feeding themselves. So by spearfishing for fish, we've taught them how to fish. It's that old analogy. Feed a man, give a fish to feed a man, feed a man a day, give him a fish. You want to feed him for his lifetime, teach him how to fish. I mean, it's the same principle. So, it's just dumbass trial and error and dumb luck for us to understand how some exotic technology or formula or field works. And once we do, and we look back at it, we smack ourselves on the forehead and go, duh. I mean, how simple could this thing be compared to, we overthink things. It's just a comprehension. It's a material application. It's how they found an exotic material, created a material, formed a device. I mean, I'm looking at some overview stuff of what he said in his various interviews over the years about the device in particular. It was very simplistic in its construction. It wasn't complicated. It didn't seem complicated. It was massively out of our comfort zone because the fact it was too simple. We couldn't see the controls because there were no controls. We couldn't see where all the wires, and we couldn't test the individual wires because there are no individual wires. That's apparent in its design. It's almost organic if you listen to it. So several organic components put together in such a manner that they react to each other in the proximity of other components. This is why there's no wires in the craft. There's no plumbing, there's no tubing, there's no emitters that emit arcs of energy amongst the devices, that etc. etc. So this makes it's just like how he describes the craft itself being either metal or possibly ceramic, but organic. There's no right angles. It's all smooth. It's all seamless. There's very few access points. There's no toilet, for example. There's a simple access to get to the upper compartment and the lower compartment where all these devices sit. There's no obvious layers of conduit and piping and protection and insulation and all this stuff, which reminds me of 3D printing to some degree. If the possibility that this is an organic craft, that it was grown mechanically speaking, as opposed to, potentially it's a big giant silicon thing that was grown through a process to fill what it needed to do, and then the components were added to the interior. Or everything was formulated through a technology that we have loose understandings on, or none at all. I mean, 3D technology, for example, 3D printing is what I'm specifically stating, was created back in before the 80s. And it was only, yeah, I mean, what did I say? Should I look that up? 3D printing, a lot of the core technical concepts lead to chrome full blown, no, that's 3D printing in the early 80s, additive manufacturing, a type of rapid prototyping, which it's also known as 3D printing, was developed in the early 80s. Designs were crude, limited, and fragile, but we often tout that as a modern thing, that somehow or another we created 3D printing in the last 5 years, and it's really taken off. Well, the truth has been around much, much longer. So the possibility that these craft were organically or manufactured as a component in and of themselves, and the components themselves, like the power core, the antigrav generator that he worked on, or he played with and fiddled with and was horrified by the possibilities, the amount of energy poured through this thing, was organically created or mechanically printed, or divined in that nature. This allows for such things as the wiring and conduit and insulation. Everything can be neatly woven together in the device as a solid piece, right? All right, I'm going to take a small break here, folks. Be right back. Well, folks, I'm back. Hopefully I didn't mess that up, because my programming, I'm running on a laptop that's 2 years old and was old when I bought it new. And I use this program to create the videos that I do, and it burns up a lot of CPU use. And hopefully someday in the near future I can afford to buy a bigger, fancier laptop than I got. Occasionally it barfs up everything, and I either lose sound or I lose the whole project, and I have to go back and start from scratch, which is not the same, because each time you do something it's a little different. So, potential for 3D printing these devices. So we'll go back to Lazar and his credentials at the time. Okay, it makes sense to me that if, from the perspective of those extremely paranoid, security-conscious individuals who potentially are running this program back in the day, that getting the best of the best is not exactly the great thing. You're dealing with prima donnas, you're dealing with people who have high expectations, and a lot of those really top-notch people truly are not willing to shut themselves off in some cavern somewhere working on something they can never talk to and brag about to their peers. Getting somebody who's not so advanced, so full of himself, and or academically high strung, is one of those things you kind of want. It's an attraction. It also makes it easier later if something goes south, like in Lazar's case, that they can have plausible deniability. Well, he wasn't that great. He did a blah blah blah. He was midstream of the class. Oh, why would we hire him for something like that? He doesn't even have a background in what we wanted, etc., etc. Which, ironically, that's what they did against him in some aspects. If you take a literal view of what was done and what's said that was done, it makes absolute sense. Pretty much everything Lazar claims to have had happened to him and continues to have happened to him to this day is the exact sort of thing you would think and believe and expect from those types that run those programs, who are afraid to think outside the box. Their idea of thinking outside the box is putting you in the ground somewhere, because that's the best they can do. It's the best they can come up with. But they work and they try, and they do so hard. So absolutely, I can see and believe what's being said, in my opinion, because it makes sense to me. And it's just like in the program. So he sits down, and the first day or two he gets there, he says, you put him in a room, probably a cafeteria or meeting room, that kind of sort, and put down a whole stack of overviews of all these different programs that are affiliated with the program he's now being inducted into. And there's like 118 or whatever, 188 or whatever. It was a very large number. Now, why would you do this? If you're extremely sensitive to the idea that somebody, when it comes to security reasons, that's even giving somebody an overview of all these programs seems outrageous. But it also is practical, because you can never know for sure. Even the most security conscious is going to have somebody of academia in charge of things, somebody in the research field, administratively speaking, has to understand that in order for these engineers and scientists and explorative people to function, they need to have some information, and having basic information works out. So I'm giving them access to a preliminary of all these different possible things. It's just like I would make the leap of function, the leap of faith, even though I have yet to hear Lazar mention this or somebody else mention it in his name, that he had access to his predecessor's notes and material. Why would you sit this for a fresh note? No, it may not have been immediate. It may have been later. Perhaps he didn't work in the program long enough to gain that trust, and whatever. But why would you have a group of people or a series of individuals over decades continuously research something and not share notes? Because why would it would be counterproductive? There are elements that it would make sense to do this, because you're not going to color the view of the new guy or gal coming in. They're going to have their own views and perspectives. And then somebody, a third party, is the one that collates everything and takes your, so you constantly recovering the same ground over and over again in hopes that maybe you're going to strike a different vein, or you're going to come across a different aha. But foreknowledge is knowledge. So having some information is imperative. I question the amount of material of different programs that he was given moderate access to an overview of. Some of it, I think, was trick stuff to set him up so later down the road, if he starts spewing out things in public, they got more information. Say, look, that was classified, confidential. You signed paperwork, etc., etc. We own you. We own you for the rest of your life now because of it, or you could be put in federal prison to shut you up. So some of it could be bogus, but some of it could be truth, and I think probably a lot of it was truth. It's just to give him an overknowledge, because they might discover that maybe he's more suited for a different part of the program than what they initially wanted him for. So there's a lot of possibility there, right? It's just like later when things his personal life takes a big bump, and the government shuts him down. They basically send him home, and they don't tell him why. They give him a leave of absence without telling him he's on a leave of absence, because he never knows from one day to the next what his schedule is going to be. He gets a phone call, and this is when you need to be at the airport. Well, that's kind of hard to make a scheduled life around that. I mean, that might have changed later on, or that also might be the explanation of why people like Barry just don't go home. Why bother having a life outside the place unless it's the occasional vacation, because this were the BS. And what are you missing out on when you're not there, kind of thing. So that when he starts feeling that he's being followed around, that he's being shut out, at this point he starts taking some chances. First off, he wants to salvage his marriage because his wife's probably cheating on him, because she herself has absolutely no idea what the hell he's doing at all these weird hours and times. And after a while, if he refuses constantly to explain it to her, they're not even allowed to. This is where I find it questionable in the aspect of on the side of the government or the people in charge. I think you should have brought in the family and explained what you can explain without explaining. So look, you can see we're a government agency, or we're somebody, and he's going someplace. We're not going to tell you where and why and how long, and just know that he's doing very important work, and you need to understand that. But I don't think they approached it from that perspective. So they eavesdropped on him. They followed him around. He started to get a little paranoid and concerned, and for good reason, because most of us would be in the same situation. And how you react under stress is an individual thing. We all do things different. Barry probably barricaded himself in S4. He just solved the problem of not having to worry about any of that stuff by never going home. And I'm just speculating there. Lazar, on the other hand, goes to his friends and family and says, and his wife, and says, look, this is what's going on, or as much as I'm willing to tell you, but I want to prove it. Or they're like, yeah, okay, bullshit. Well, I'm going to take you out. We'll go out in the desert on a Wednesday night when they're doing maneuvers with these things, because I know when the schedule is, because I looked into knowing this. And he takes them out there, and lo and behold, some things happen, and they get it on video, and that's for something else. That's a completely different video on my part, or what have you. But the fact is, he did what he did. And then he went out there several times. The third time, they got more sloppy and careless and party-like about it as they went, he said. So on the third time, they were talking smack of some crazy stuff. Just the crazy casual stuff that you would never say in front of if you knew somebody was listening. But he became complacent and talking about stealing the thing, going out there, doing this, doing that. And lo and behold, there's a whole security detail 20 feet away in the dark listening to him the whole time, probably recording things to boot. That didn't work well. That's not from somebody that's thinking. That's just somebody that's acting. That's a normal human condition and easily believable from anybody's perspective. So I believe that's exactly what happened, and I challenge any of you to tell me that at some point in your life, there's a handful you goody two-shoes that probably can say that, but there's always the majority that have been in a situation that found themselves it turned awkward really fast. You were gossiping about somebody, and they were standing behind you, and you didn't know it, or they were on the phone and you didn't know it, or you make some snarky comments or snide comments about doing something that's questionable or morally unethical or illegal, and somebody of authority is right over there looking at you, shaking their head, going, "Yeah," and you think, "Oh, oh crap! I got to do some backwalk. I got to back up on this. In the modern day, we send the wrong tweet or the wrong email out to the wrong people or to a whole lot of people, and we're suddenly we're in the doghouse. That is also a human condition. Quite a believable thing, right? In my opinion. So here we are. Bob Lazar, my little opinion, his claims on working at S4, the fact that he knew about S4 before anybody else did, publicly speaking, some years before. A lot of the things that he claimed in the mid-'80s when he came out and did his early interviews were squashed and put down by the government and by other people. And now in modern, recent days or weeks or months or years, suddenly it's the truth. We now know there was an S4, or it still is an S4, and probably other facilities out there, because that's where they put things like that. It makes perfectly good sense. And we were talking that lateral layered security thing, not that horizontal layered thing. So having Area 51 being a top secret facility for doing aircraft experimentations and other mundane things of advanced technology or just stuff we don't want the Russians and other people to know about as much as possible or little as possible makes perfectly good sense. But because you have such a vast facility out there, you have the opportunities to add another lateral layer of security or another facility and other facilities to practice and work on things and do things and store stuff, and it can be borderline exotic and advanced and dangerous, potentially morally unethical, depending on how you want to spin the bottle on that stuff. Absolutely. All right. It's just like his claim to the element 115. He talked about it right after his involvement in S4, and nobody even knew what the heck this thing was. And now suddenly we have a breakthrough. He was talking about the anti-gravity field and its effects decades before anybody even could prove such a thing existed. There were theoretical suggestions by a number, like Einstein and stuff, that implied this possibility was there, but it wasn't until the last few years that there was an actual physical response, or was it something to do with some binary stars or something like that? I have to dig into that a little bit more, because I know they were talking about it. I'll have to get that information. But the fact is, it's now element 115 is on the elemental chart, and let me see, what did I? Yeah, because that in itself was an interesting thing. Yes, it's here. Lazar mentions dread when he fully understands the level of power represented by an anti-grav device he was studying. Yeah, that's another subject I want to talk about. Here he goes. Element 115, new heavy element, was officially discovered in 2013, some 30 odd years after he started talking about this. Why would they? Now, if they were, you gotta, in my mind, I'm just saying, in my mind, I have to go and I have to look at my notes and I have to think, what's going on? If you were just a super secret program you didn't want nobody to know about, and this element's included in that, and you spend most of your time playing footsie with it, denying it exists. 30 odd years later, what do? You add it to the periodical chart. You officially acknowledge you're capable of creating it in very limited numbers. You give it a very strange moniker, UUP, unpentium, or MC115 on the table. UUP, up. It's just a play, right? But why not call it something, element, something else, right? Well, it's explained. I did do a little look, obviously, because I got notes on it. I did a little research in that, and it tells me that they did. That there's a certain point in heavy metal development that reaches the level between 114 and 116 that it becomes stable enough for creation and sustaining it for a certain length of time or indefinitely. And somehow or other, this particular element is crucial in the powering of these devices and this technology that Bob Lazar had worked on. And like I said, I didn't take this as literal. I believe he says he worked on it. He worked on it. I have no position to say he did or didn't, or it's fantastic, or it's a lie, or it's a conspiracy, or it's twist this or that. That's BS, right? You want to see a conspiracy in action today? Watch your president and listen to him day after day for the last 2 months while this COVID-19 pandemic killing people. And yes, more people died of the regular flu last year than has died of COVID in this country at the moment. More people died in car crashes last year than has died in COVID. Fine. But when you have your highest elected official start out with it, only one person died. It's nothing. We got it under control. The lie after lie after lie after spin after twist on public TV, on public broadcasting, on publicly, on the internet, where everything you do and say in front of a camera becomes more or less embedded perpetual. So you can sit there and say you didn't say something when half the world population's seen and heard you say what you say. And then 20 minutes later or 20 days later make that claim, I never said that. Well, that's just insanity, right? Now this man was in the 80s. The internet didn't exist. It was, for the public, definitely didn't exist. I was one of the earliest people in 91. I was on CompuServe, and I was paying upwards of $3 an hour for access to this stuff, right? And just saying. And I'm not a highly advanced Yahoo. I just had an uncle who was really big into the internet and the computers, and he got me involved in it early on. So the fact was, when they talked about how that somebody went to great lengths to try to eradicate Bob Lazar's history. And you think, well, that's absurd. It's impossible. Well, is it? Is it really? A virus today can wipe out hordes and hordes of amount of technical computer files and what have you. Truth is, everything's digital today. Digital can be easily lost or corrupted or disappear. Back in the day, was a little harder, but not impossible. It was all on paperwork, and it wasn't huge amounts of copies. That's what makes things much harder to do today. Once you put something out here, this video alone is one of hundreds of, maybe thousands of Bob Lazar related what have yous that are going out onto the internet, going into the internet databases forever, as far as I know. Well, right? This stuff gets logged in, and that's whatever you do on the net stays on the net and in public. Whereas back in the day, when I was a kid, computers were very few and far in between. I remember in my mid-years in high school, my first name, middle name, and last name were so long that and they always started with their last name first, that my first name often lost the last 3 letters because they had a 21-letter limit to what they could do at the time. So having a paper trail is much easier to dispose of than an electronic trail. But electronic trails can be disposed of. So somebody went into his colleges and universities and removed his files. Potentially somebody went in and bribed a handful of key people in those facilities, or considering the nature of the research, the nature of the entities behind the programs that Bob Lazar was involved in, are heavily connected with academia for a good reason. How do you know if you can't get the top of the top? Look at research in general. Most large academia, most large universities run research programs. You have many top-notch people teaching in and access to fresh, brand new minds or brilliant people in those universities. Why not take advantage of that? And they do. So the fact is that somebody's pulling the purse strings and controlling things also takes an interest in those things. So it would not be too radically difficult to maintain that certain things disappear. We could even look at this YouTube here, this W4 or W2 form we're looking at, W2 form. It's the only one. Now, why is that? You say, well, he should have dozens and dozens of these. And by the amount of money that's on there, I'd say this was one of his first ones or his last one, because it doesn't show. To me, I think he'd make a bit more than he's what's listed on there. But you can see that somebody's deleted his social security number. That's for security purposes for him. But the fact is that they could do that. Now, this is altered. This is an altered document. It's not the original anymore. It's an original that's been altered, or a copy of the original that's been altered. And why doesn't he have scores of these things? Well, I can't speak for that. I know that I'm guilty of throwing a lot of that kind of stuff away, because you only get one a year. This isn't a paycheck stub. I mean, you're not going to have a whole slew of these things, and maybe you keep your records and are very diligent about it, but maybe you don't. And I bet you there's quite a few people like myself, only in recent times, this recent year, since I started just throwing everything into a folder every month, dating the folder and tossing it in a box, just in case. That way I can go back and I can pull up that particular month, and here's all that stuff, all my receipts, all my payrolls and pay stubs, and any kind of my bills and bill receipts and so on and so forth. It's kind of a smart thing to do. But when I was younger, I didn't care about this sort of crap. I was in my 20s. I never kept any of this stuff. I don't have any of that stuff from my 20s and 30s. Just don't, right? So it's not unexpected. It's not hard. And an attempt to discredit the man, to make him, he's come out with a very damning and fantastic story. And the fact is, I'm going to be in my literally honest opinion here. That was a mistake on the part of those idiots in charge of security to do that. They want to punish the guy. They want to shut him up. I mean, I get what the motives behind it was. But to actively go out of your way to seem to try to erase somebody's history, and you can't do it fully. You're not successful fully doing it. Well, you just add more fuel to the fire. This isn't part why some conspiracists out there claim that he's a plant by the government to make to muck up things. I don't believe that. I believe the story he portrays is damn right literal. Now, when I was in my 20s, I had an uncle who was a truck driver, and he got out of the service after he spent a number of years in there, and he got a contract with the government. It was quite a lucrative contract. He bought a tractor trailer every 3 years, and they reimbursed him for it. And he hired nothing but material for the government. And he never knew what he was hauling. He never asked. He might be hauling a tanker. I rode with him once. I had a couple of cousins that rode with him and told me different stories. I rode him once. He went down to an old World War II airfield in Missouri, and the place had been shut down since the 60s or 50s. And he had a key to the gate. He went up, unlocked this old rusty gate, drove into the facility, way into the back, to a section that was the buildings were falling down, and so on and so forth. Unlocks a box on the ground that reveals a fairly new and well-maintained fuel port, and unloads the tanker into an underground storage tank, and locks everything up and leaves. What was that about? You tell me what you think that was about. Right? So I'm just saying, lots of crazy stuff goes on. I have opinions on what that was too, but that's not what this is about. So we talk about Bob Lazar and this claim others put out as an American conspiracy theorist. I don't tell you, Bob Lazar did some interviews. They did this thing on Netflix recently that is not so good. Frankly, it's more about the guy that made it hamming himself around than the material that could have been done better. But that's not here nor there. And other stuff. But the man, Lazar himself, is not a big advocate of UFOs and aliens and government conspiracies. He doesn't sit there with a vlog and a blog and his video, his own YouTube channel, lambasting and bringing on guests and going everywhere in the world talking about this stuff. He's often reluctantly dragged into it. I guess the Joe Rogan people had to really kind of, talk him into coming on the show. And when he was on the show, he was suffering from a migraine headache. And I found that interesting too, a bit disconcerting somewhat, wondering if maybe his short experience or, working in that strange place with those strange things and other stuff going on there hasn't left him with some physical, biological issues, right? Maybe it's just a migraine. Maybe it is. Maybe the pressure of coming out one more time and talking about all this insanity created this massive headache for him. And I can relate. I can philosophically put my feet in his shoes and think, yeah, I can see how this would give me a grind ass freaking headache migraine too. I tell people the same story over and over and over again, and yet another person or group of people or another generation wants to drag it all out again. And nobody cares and nobody does anything about it, or so on and so forth, and they move forward. They move on. So there you have my opening gambit for Bob Lazar, a literal opinion.